Why the United States is not a nation of immigrants. Every fact you need to know. This one's going to be fun.
If you've looked at United States politics at any time in the last few decades, you've likely heard the phrase that the United States is a nation of immigrants.
Yep, I hear that all the time.
This phrase has been echoed by both Democrats and Republicans for quite some time, and is most often used in the context of defending mass immigration into the United States. The phrase has its origins in the late 1950s, where it was heavily promoted by the Anti-Defamation League, an international NGO. Ultimately, a book titled
The story of the ADL is quite interesting. Actually, I looked into that the other day, and it was very interesting.
A Nation of Immigrants was sponsored by this organization and released by John F. Kennedy in 1958. And today, one doesn't have to look far to see the mantra being repeated.
We in America are immigrants.
We are a nation of immigrants.
We are a nation of immigrants.
The United States.
Nation of immigrants. I guess it's going to be on the definition of immigrant, because Nation of immigrants, I guess you're no longer an immigrant after you were born here, right? If your family immigrates here and then you were born here, then you're not an immigrant at that point. I guess, is that the point he's going to make?
This is a nation of immigrants.
America is a nation of immigrants.
We are a nation of immigrants.
I think that's the point he's going to try to make. Is that is that people did immigrate here, but then a lot of the people here now were born here.
I think you see what I mean. But there is a problem with this mantra. It simply isn't true. And it certainly isn't true in the way its proponents want it to be, to justify any and all immigration. To understand why this is, one needs to engage in a thorough review of American history. So without further ado, let's get to the facts that you need to know.
Okay.
Things begin in the colonial period. Most of the first successful settlers that arrived in the land that would become the United States arrived in the early 1600s. These included English, French, Scottish, Spanish,
Sure, ethnically we didn't originate on this continent, but
others.
To say we are a nation of immigrants is intellectual dishonesty.
Sure, ethically we didn't originate on this continent, but say, yeah, that's what I think he's gonna say, Andrew. I think it's gonna be two different things. I think this is just my guess. I haven't seen this video. One, that you're not an immigrant if you were born here, and two, we're not talking about the same thing, because immigration from back then is kind of different than how it is now, I guess. Is what they might say, is that because there's an actual... Actually, I don't know about that one, the second point. The first point, the second one I have to think about it a little bit more.
What all of these colonists had in common was that they were arriving to a land that had very little infrastructure. It was an incredibly dangerous and risky environment. At the time, it took almost 2 months just to cross the Atlantic, and partly because of this, food was an extremely scarce resource. One bad harvest could devastate a community. To give you an idea of the type of threat this posed, after just 2 bad winters, the population of the colony of Jamestown dropped from 500 to 60. While some settlers did encounter Native American communities, this often caused more trouble than it was worth, as it was typically a coin toss if this would result in a friendly encounter or a battle. Here's what should be underlined about this time period. Firstly, the settlers were...
Are these birch trees? They're so pretty.
...not arriving to a well-established country. They were arriving to what was largely wilderness, and they faced threats of famine and Native American attacks. Secondly, the majority of these settlers were coming from Europe. The English, French, and Spanish would go on to dominate the Americas. Those coming to colonial America who were not from Europe were for the most part slaves brought from Africa. However, it's important to point out the scale. Slaves comprised less than 5% of the 13 colonies' population until the year 1690, almost 80 years after the first colony was established. And finally, it took months making a dangerous journey across the Atlantic for anyone coming to the Americas to even have hope of settling. It's often argued that the United States government had more hands-off immigration policy in its early decades, but there's 2 issues with this. The first is that immigration was still largely controlled by the states, and the second, and more important, is this brutal journey. Until the mid-1800s, a ship crossing the Atlantic could only carry about 500 passengers on an extremely crowded ship. Many of the passengers wouldn't survive that kind of journey due to disease and other problems. The technology that would allow for true mass migration did not yet exist. and would not exist until the turn of the 20th century, which we'll get to in a little bit. Even into the 1850s, there were thousands of immigrants dying in the Atlantic Ocean trying to get to the United States. The fact that there was a relatively low number of new arrivals coming to the young U.S., combined with the fact that those who did come had to be incredibly competent to make the journey, is why the U.S. had lacked...
Am I watching in, I think so. Oh, why did it auto to that? Thank you so much, Julio.
...immigration laws in its first few decades.
I don't know why I defaulted to 360. That's weird. Thank you for catching that, Julio.
Perhaps even more important to understand is that the early U.S. had strict naturalization laws. Naturalization allowed someone to vote and become a citizen. Thus, those without naturalization had next to no political power. The Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted this naturalization to only free white people of good character who had been in the U.S. for 2 years. In 1795, that requirement was up to 5 years. The act also required those being naturalized to renounce all allegiance to any foreign power or state. This law remained largely unchanged until 1870, when aliens of African descent were also given access to naturalization. This means that for the first 100 years of U.S. history, immigrants were unable to become citizens or vote unless they were vetted Europeans who had lived in the country for 5 years. Does that sound like a nation of immigrants to you? Now, some may be thinking, in the first 100 years of United States history, maybe it wasn't really a nation of immigrants. But surely by the turn of the 20th century, when passenger ships could bring thousands of people at a time to the US, that's when it became a nation of immigrants. After all, the Statue of Liberty was built in 1886, and the 1880s to 1910s saw huge spikes of immigration never seen before in United States history. This is when many people's ancestors, including some of mine, came to the United States. However, that all being said, the idea
the dark music
made the United States a nation of immigrants comparable to the modern context is still inaccurate. Let's get into why. First of all, let's talk about the Statue of Liberty. Contrary to what some think, the Statue of Liberty was not put in place to be a symbol of the United States welcoming immigrants. The statue was, in fact, a gift to the United States
from France
in order to celebrate 100 years of American independence, as well as to commemorate the abolition of slavery. Keen observers may have known this from the broken shackles that can be seen near the statue's feet. Being unveiled in 1886, the statue came at the same time the U.S. was passing some of the most restrictive immigration laws in its history. Indeed, the poem that's regularly cited to connect the statue to immigration was not added until nearly 20 years later. Ultimately, immigration advocates citing the statue do it for sentimental purposes, not factual ones. It's a similar situation with the phrase E pluribus unum. This motto is referring to uniting the 13 colonies to declare independence. It had nothing whatsoever to do with immigration. Returning to the main timeline, immigration into the U.S. did indeed rise greatly at the turn of the 20th century, but it's not as if Congress simply stood by while this happened. To respond to these increases, they passed a variety of immigration restrictions. These included the Immigration Acts of 1882, 1907, and 1917. One highlight of the acts was creating new categories of immigrants who were completely inadmissible to the United States, such as, quote, any convict, lunatic, idiot, or person unable to take care of him or herself without becoming a public charge.
Oh, no idiots.
The act ordered that these categories not even be allowed to enter U.S. land. These regulations were typically enforced at port through the judgment of immigration officers. The 1907 Act was signed into law by Theodore Roosevelt, who was a firm supporter of assimilating new immigrants into American culture. Any man who says he is an American but something else also isn't an American at all.
Yeah.
We have room for but one flag, the American flag.
Based.
We have room for but one language, and that is the English language.
Yes.
And we have room for but one sole loyalty, and that is a loyalty to the American people.
God bless America and no place else.
Roosevelt also stated his intention on preventing
I agree with all of that, by the way.
the United States from becoming a nation brought to ruins by a tangle of squabbling nationalities. And when we look at our country today, we see what he was referring to. As a side note, many modern progressives think that because Teddy Roosevelt called himself a progressive, that they must...
I'm not saying you can't speak another language. I'm just saying like you should prioritize, like you should learn English, basically. I don't think you should allow people to get full citizenship without being able to speak English.
Similar political opinions. However, clearly that is not true.
That's for everyone, by the way. I don't care where you're from. What's wrong with that? Like, America's official language is English. If you want to be a citizen of America, shouldn't you speak English? You shouldn't expect, like, the people who are born in America, a country that speaks English, to have to learn another language in order to communicate with you. The thing is you have to be able to speak English to understand, like, a lot of the things in America. And, like, I understand, like, having things in Spanish or other languages, Spanish, Chinese, whatever, Japanese, whatever other language, for people that are kind of here for work, because that's the thing. There are going to be people that have to work here, right, from other, like, you know, like, companies send, like, workers to, like, America for, like, their own, like, corporations that, like, they're kind of having a base in America. Yeah, you're gonna have people like that, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, like, citizenship. So, like, say you did come to America, like, for work because of, like, work purposes, and you're like, you know what, I really like America, I want to live here. You should be able to speak English before you actually become a citizen. That doesn't seem like a weird thing to me. And again, I apply that to everyone. I'm not talking, like, strictly only Spanish people or only people that speak Chinese. I mean, literally everyone. If you come here and you only speak, I don't know, Swedish, I don't think that's a good idea either.
Moving on, though.
Too many want it as a 100% requirement. If someone doesn't speak it, then that is their struggle. Yeah, but that's their struggle and not America's. Do you see what I'm saying? Sure, you can say that, like, oh, well, you know, that's just their problem. Why do you worry about it? Yeah, but it's also not our problem.
It's also important to note that during this time, as it was through all of U.S. history to this point, almost all of the...
America loses nothing from someone not speaking English? Yeah, it does. It's annoying as fuck. Because if you're American and you only speak English, and you're like, this is my country, and then you can't even communicate with somebody because they can't speak English, and, like, they're also a citizen? What the fuck? That doesn't make any sense.
The new immigrants were arriving from Europe. This time, the majority were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, though Northern and Western Europe...
Honestly, I think it's a perfectly fair requirement. There are other countries that straight up won't even let you be a citizen. Like, you have to understand, America is incredibly generous with this. Other countries, like in Asia, they won't even let you join. If you're not, your nationality is not from, you know, your ethnic nationality is not from that country, then you can't even be a citizen. It's ridiculous. This is crazy.
As well as Canada, continued to make up a size. The Chinese Exclusion Act had also been passed in 1882, and it banned effectively all East Asian immigration. What are the main takeaways from this time period? The first is that, although the US was indeed allowing in new immigrants, it was only accepting them from specific parts of the world, mainly Europe. Secondly, it required that strict competency, financial...
Listen, guys. This might be a hot take. It has nothing to do with spending money. Expecting immigrants who move here and want to become American citizens, expecting them to speak English has nothing to do with cost. I don't give a fuck about the costs. It could cost zero and I wouldn't care. For me, it's about respecting America as a country, expecting that English is our language, respecting the people that live here. That's what it's about.
And moral standards be met by these new immigrants.
If you move here and you don't want to assimilate and become American, then what the fuck are you doing?
Any suggestion that the United States
is not a charity. America's not a charity. You don't have a right to be here. It's by the grace of Americans that you are allowed to become a citizen. It's if we want you to. That's my whole point.
Allowed anyone into the country during this time is the opposite of reality. Furthermore,
and I don't get how this is crazy. For some reason, this exists in a ton of other countries. And in fact, a lot of other countries won't even let you become a citizen no matter what if you weren't born there and you aren't, like, ethnically from that country. They won't even let you get a citizenship. Number one. Everyone expects America to just bend over and get fucked in the ass all the time. And the Americans are like, okay, you're right, guys. I'm so sorry for being American. Jesus Christ.
The U.S. population was growing mostly from native births, not from new immigrants.
God, it pisses me off so much.
American women had a fertility rate of 3.4. To put that into perspective, the modern U.S. fertility rate is 1.8, the lowest in its recorded history. As if everything so far wasn't bad enough for the Nation of Immigrants narrative, things get even worse for it in the 1920s. In 1924, Congress completely overhauled immigration. It established a quota system that would put hard caps on immigration and allow in new ones based on the demographics of the 1890 census. The main effect of this was that immigrants from Western Europe received the largest portion of the visas. What Congress had decided was to set a clear demographic path for the United States and its future. The U.S. Office of the Historian puts it thus: in all of its parts, the most basic purpose of the 1924 Immigration Act was to preserve the ideal of U.S. homogeneity. To Congress in the 1920s, it was common sense that genetic and cultural ties...
I got a little riled up. I felt the rage. The rage came out a little bit there. Just a little bit.
Between people were the bedrock of prosperous nations. That sense is seemingly lost on many politicians and voters today. The quota system was ultimately very successful. Through both the 1930s and 40s, immigration stayed very low compared to previously. This low level made assimilation very easy.
They learned American literature, the American language, American history, American heroes. It is far more easy to assimilate if you had 1 million Englishmen coming into Virginia than if you had 1 million folks, 1 million Zulu from my friend Chief Butalese's tribe.
Also, when I say that you have to be able to speak English, I don't mean like perfect native speaker English. I'm talking about like functional English. Okay, guys.
Many people who have no personal value system or faith latch onto quote virtues end quote in an attempt to feel good about themselves. And that manifests in this modern version of virtue signaling at the expense of established citizens.
Thank you for the bits, Andrew. Yeah. I just think, I don't know, call me crazy. I just think Americans should care more about themselves. That's all I'm saying. I don't care if it sounds mean. I just think it's what we should do. It doesn't make, I don't get it. I'm not saying like we can't take care of other people and that we can't like care about other countries. All I'm saying is that like we can't just keep taking it in the ass. That's all I'm saying. We shouldn't let everyone talk down on us and tell us that like, oh, like you should just take it, even though like no one else is doing it.
By the 1950s, the US Census showed that the demographics of the country were still very similar.
We shouldn't let other people bully us into like this whole, like the whole notion that we should just take it. I don't think we should. That's all I'm saying.
To what they were in the 1920s. The census found that the US population was 87% non-Hispanic white, 10% black, while every other racial group made up just 3%. The country was also over 90% Christian, with 95% of those saying that religion was important in their lives. This highlights that for the previous 100 years, the immigrants had also been nearly entirely Christian. The 1952 McCarran-Walter Act continued the quota system. During this time, Congress was very concerned about communist subversion of the United States. Pat McCarran, the U.S. Senator from Nevada who helped create the act, argued thus in continuing the quota system. Today, as never before, untold millions are storming our gates for admission, and those gates are cracking under the strain. The solutions of the problems of Europe and Asia will not come through a transplanting of those problems en masse to the United States. If the enemies of this legislation succeed in riddling it to pieces or in amending it beyond recognition, they will have contributed more to promote this nation's downfall than any other group since we have achieved our independence.
But I just want to be clear, just in case, you know, I've said it before, but I just want to be clear. I'm not anti-immigration. I'm pro-immigration in which it benefits us. I'm not against immigration. I just care that the immigration benefits us. That's the bottom line for me.
Independence as a nation. It's not hard to see why McCarran and the majority of Congress saw things this way. Throughout the 40s and 50s, U.S. state secrets were rampantly being stolen by espionage rings, and many of those spies were either immigrants or children of immigrants.
Would you go into a game and just like have an open lobby and then not freaking kick people if they come in and like they suck or they talk some shit and you don't like it?
One of the most infamous examples was the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The couple, as well as a ring of other immigrant-connected spies, were convicted in 1951 of providing classified information to the Soviet Union. Some of this stolen information involved...
Did they get executed? Did we put the cute in execute?
The Manhattan Project, and its acquisition by the Soviets allowed them to complete their atomic weapon years ahead of schedule. For their part in the plot, the Rosenbergs were executed by electric chair in 1953. The other conspirators all received lengthy prison sentences. This case of espionage was one of many that increased U.S. government scrutiny of foreigners for the rest of the 1950s.
That was a like real scary shit though, because that was like that was a big deal. That's like major threat shit like back in the day.
As the 1960s approached, the United States was still not a nation of immigrants in any meaningful way. Quotas had upheld the European and Christian character of the country, and even among those European immigrants, preference was given to the founding Western European stock. Native births had continued to drive the country's population increase, not immigration. The baby boom stands out as an example of this. So you may be thinking, wait a minute, how did the United States go from having strict quotas, mostly European Christian immigrants, and a Congress skeptical of foreigners, to the modern-day immigration system? In the modern-day immigration system, not only are there not quotas, but about 1 million immigrants enter the United States.
Dude, that's so many people.
Every
Look at the increase, actually.
single year from all over the world. The answer to this is the 1965 Immigration Act, or the Hart-Celler Act, signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, covering this act really deserves its own video, but in summary, it established a new immigration system primarily based on family ties and employment preferences. It abolished all national origin qualifications to immigrate. That meant that the quota system was no more. One of its other most lasting effects was allowing new immigrants to sponsor their family members to also enter the country. This phenomenon.
So on that part, I mean, this is just what I believe. Whatever. You can believe whatever you want. Just what Leaflit believes. I think it doesn't really matter what country they're from, as long as they care about American values. I think that's like the number one thing that we should test for, and then we should also test that they're going to be a benefit to America in general. Like maybe they have some skills, they have some money they want to invest, something like that. Like they have some factor that would be beneficial to us. I don't really believe on letting people immigrate just cause like they're from a poor situation, like we should like let them immigrate. I don't believe in that. I don't think so. It's not our responsibility to.
Phenomenon is now called chain migration.
But I also don't think that it matters what country that they're from. As long as they're willing to assimilate to American values and be a contributing member of society, those are the two things I care about.
At the time of its passage, the act was viewed as an extension of the.
Sorry, I paused again. I can see why though. Like if you don't have the resources to like look into that, right? Because vetting people is kind of hard, right? Like you have to spend a lot of money in order to like vet people properly, right? So I can see why they would say only from these countries that have Christian values and European, because by doing that you can sort of filter it. Do you see what I mean? Like you can kind of filter it because you're like, okay, well, they're from this country. This country has like very similar values to us. Therefore, like they would be a good fit. So I can understand like why they would do that. It makes sense to me.
Civil Rights Act, and even its proponents that
it is a good filter in the absence of better information, which is why if you want to vet people from other countries, we have to put a couple resources into that, into like actually trying to vet them. The idea that we should allow people from any country and then not vet them doesn't make any sense to me. In fact, the argument is stronger for they should be from countries that more share our values. That argument makes sense in the absence of more information.
not seem to expect it to change the United States demographics extremely. However, it did.
Is that not how our immigration system works? Like theoretically, but it doesn't apply with illegal immigration, right? Letting people come in and claim asylum, like make invalid asylum claims based on financial reasons, and then just letting a lot of people in illegally, and then saying like, oh well, they're already here, so we have to make them citizens. That doesn't make any sense to me.
30 years following the Act's passage, the number of legal immigrants entering the country more than tripled from the immigrants entering the previous 30 years. This does not even take into account countless illegal immigrants. But in any case, since 1965, no longer are Europeans the main source of U.S. immigrants. In fact,
holy fuck,
now towards the bottom of the list. In their place are countries like Mexico, China, India, and the Philippines. Mexico has been the largest source of immigration nearly every year since 1965,
holy crap,
only being surpassed by India in 2017. This wild transformation was in part driven by economic factors. By the 1950s, the US and Europe had some of the highest standards of living in the entire world. Because of this, many Europeans no longer
Dang, dude, look at Venezuela. In 1950, they were popping off. And then freaking socialism happened. Holy fuck, they were number 4. They were number 4. They were better than everyone else.
felt the need to immigrate to the United States. At the same time, the economic gap between the Western world and the Third World continued to increase. This caused many to scramble to take advantage of the US's new lax immigration policy. And to be clear, neither of these trends has changed in the last 60 years. Truthfully, the only similarity between immigrants before 1965 and immigrants now is that they're immigrants. The circumstances have entirely changed. A new immigrant to the United States in 2020 is offered welfare programs, public benefits, and a standard of living that immigrants...
Dunk says cheap labor, baby, let the poor workers in and keep our wages low. I can see that being the reason why businesses want to keep the immigration flow coming in, which is fucked up, by the way. Fuck those guys.
Immigrants arriving in the 1800s and early 1900s could only dream of. On top of this, new immigrants today are allowed to keep their citizenship to other countries. This has created some conflicts of interest, to say the least. When the historical record is taken in full, the United States is not a nation of immigrants. What the United States is a nation of settler, of pioneer, of builders, and most importantly, of the American people. A unique people descended from their old world ancestors.
It's so crazy to see like these old videos in like color.
And developed through the trials and tribulations of building a new nation. And though the country has changed dramatically in the last 60 years of mass immigration, the truth of its roots remain the same. A nation of Christians of European ancestry into a nation in which both groups are declining as a portion of the population. Though while our portion decreases, we shall endure.
And this is, by the way, this is like the whole world. I'm not talking about just America. Every part of the world at some point was conquered by the people that live there now.
As will our history, as long as brave souls are willing to protect it. And when the curtain is pulled back, those who would undermine these truths to peddle an ahistorical pro-immigration narrative do not have the best interests of the American people or nation at heart. And now, with everything that's...
It's like we got to a point in history where we all decided, like, let's cut that out. Right? I mean, for the most part, like humanity has gotten to a point where they're like, let's just stop this now. Like, this isn't good. Like, let's not like do that. And that's the reason why it's not, it is still kind of happening. It's still kind of happening in some places in the world. But for the most part, it's away from the worries of a lot of people in the West.
Presented to you in this video, you know the facts.
Why people like anime girls? Wait, I want to watch this too. Wait, is this bad?